Our story today is a story of the Cold War and Colonial War, a story that involves an emerging power and an old colonial power. This story takes place in Asia and dates back to the 1960s. You've already figured it out, if you haven't already. It's about Operation Vijay, the operation by the Indian government and the Indian Army to capture an enclave, the last territory that was geographically Indian but geopolitically foreign, present in the Indian subcontinent. It's an important date, an important event, that of Operation Vijay. In fact, it marks the beginning of the end of the last European colonial empire. The Portuguese Empire also marks the confrontation between an emerging power on the economic, political, and military level like India and the decline of the last great dictatorship in Europe, the Portuguese one. Salazar's story is one of confrontation and clashes, and it's a story that will have long-lasting consequences. Our story today, as you've understood, is about two powers, one on the rise and one on the decline. But to understand where Operation Vijay begins, we need to go back to 1947, when India gained independence from the British Empire. It should be said that at that time, not all the territories within the borders of the new Indian Union were under British control. Some territories depended on other governments, while others had autonomy. The most significant foreign dominion was the enclave of Goa, which included the territories of Goa, Daman, and Diu. These were historic settlements that Portugal had administered since the 16th century, and that Portugal itself considered an integral part of its own state. Within what were called the overseas provinces, the overseas territories, by the early 1960s, the Indian government led by Pandit Nehru considered these enclaves an anomaly. Goa, in particular, represented a cultural and commercial hub nestled on the western coast of India, and its continued European control was perceived as a shortcoming. In completing the decolonization process that began peacefully with Mahatma Gandhi in 1946, however, Nehru was initially determined to also pursue a peaceful solution. Diplomatic dialogue, international pressure, and negotiation attempts. For over 10 years, from the early 1950s until the early 1960s, 1961 to be exact, the Indian government had avoided an armed solution, fearing a wider conflict or even worse, international condemnation. But it did not have a counterpart to negotiate with. Portugal had declared itself unwilling to give up even a single square centimeter of its overseas territory. Since the mid-1920s, Portugal had been under the heel of one of the worst dictatorships in Europe, that of Antonio de Oliveira. Salazar, an economics professor who had been put in power by the military. After another coup d'etat, they still didn't know how to govern the state, and they had relied on Salazar, who had shaped an authoritarian state model based on the Italian example, fascist corporatism. Salazar was extremely authoritarian and supported a strict imperialist vision, and for him, giving up Goa would have meant admitting the beginning of the end of the Portuguese Empire, the decline of the Estado Novo, that state model we were talking about. That's why his government in Lisbon maintained an inflexible position over the years, categorically rejecting any idea of a peaceful withdrawal. These issues involve governments and people. What did those within the enclave think? Starting from the 1950s, there had been movements of public opinion, and nationalist political parties had developed. For example, the Go Liberation Movement, a movement that demanded the integration of the territory with India, a movement that was destined to be brutally suppressed. Portugal did not tolerate dissent. The International Police for the Defense of the State, the International Police for the Defense of the State, and then its immediate successor, the General Directorate of Security, the General Directorate of Security. They did nothing but arrest, kidnap, torture, and make opponents disappear both at home and in the overseas territories. Starting from the mid-1950s, Portugal banned all political demonstrations within the Indian enclaves. For Indian public opinion, the continued presence of a European colony on national soil, a colony, moreover, ruled by a government very different from the British one, by an authoritarian government was completely intolerable, as we said. During the 1950s, India had repeatedly tried to convince the government of Lisbon to start real negotiations. Even the United Nations had been involved in an attempt at mediation. But Portugal, confident in its unassailable position within NATO and the support of those states that still wanted to maintain their colonial empires, think of France, had ignored international resolutions and pressure. It was a situation of friction, a situation that could only end up exploding. And the point of no return was reached in 1961 when a series of incidents increased the tension. Pro-Indian militants repeatedly attempted to infiltrate Guano territory to incite locals, to demand the Portuguese withdrawal through street protests. But the Portuguese military forces respond with arrests, repression, torture, and killings. The decisive episode takes place in the summer of 1961 with the arrest and torture of Indian activists who had organized nonviolent protests. Following the long tradition of Mahatma Gandhi's teachings, this event causes a wave of outrage among Indian public opinion, which loudly demands that the government intervene. Nehru, up until that moment, had shown himself to be cautious, but the pressure from Indian public opinion could no longer be contained. By then, the idea had spread that the diplomatic strategy was a complete failure. And let's not forget another fact. The Cold War, which during that period by the 1960s was changing the global balance of power. In the 1960s, events occurred that would forever mark the Cold War. Think about the Berlin Wall, which was built during that period. Think about the downing of major power on the U-2 and the trial that followed. The Bay of Pigs and Cuban Missile Crisis are topics we've covered. Watch the video on the Echo channel. In the context of the Cold War, India, which was seeking an independent position between the Western Bloc and the Soviet Bloc, a third world position, wanted to demonstrate its ability to defend its own interests. And at that time, the international conditions finally seemed favorable. No major power was willing to support Portugal anymore, and none were willing to intervene militarily. The French colonial empire had already collapsed, first Indochina, then Algeria. The British in Africa had preferred negotiations with the various national movements to guarantee full independence to the colonies, one after another. Only Portugal remained, stubborn and obstinate, still resisting. So in December 1961, after long internal discussions, the Indian government authorized the use of force, an operation codenamed Vijay, a Sanskrit word meaning the one who wins, or simply victory. Operation Vijay is planned quickly, but extremely carefully. India planned 3 main offensive directions with coordination between the Army, Navy, and Air Force. Goa, it's the main objective. Daman and Diu need smaller actions. Portugal, in the area, has significantly fewer military forces, about 3,500 soldiers, but they are poorly equipped, plus units of colonial police. Not much, yet Salazar had given strict orders. Resist at all costs, avoid surrender. But how is it possible when the difference in strength is overwhelming? Imagine 3,500 poorly armed men without real naval support, without air force, without armored vehicles, against 30,000 men with air support and tanks. The Indian plan included several actions: a ground advance from the north and east toward Panaji, the capital of Goa, and a naval blockade to prevent any Portuguese reinforcements from arriving. It's clear sailing from Portugal to Goa took a long time. Then, targeted airstrikes on defensive infrastructure and communication facilities. There would also have been a role for special forces, who would have intervened to support the local population and to neutralize key positions, starting with the defensive bunkers. It was a quick end to the conflict to avoid civilian casualties and to soften any possible international condemnation. General Candet is put in command of the operation. He is the one responsible for the attack zone, an attack starting the morning of December 18, 1961. The Indian ground forces, who had organized themselves in the previous weeks, advanced quickly across the border. The clashes are limited but intense in some areas like Ponda and around Mapusa. The Portuguese resistance, although stubborn, is insufficient to face the advance of the Indian forces from the air. Then the Indian Air Force takes control, strikes some depots and defense positions, and deliberately avoids residential areas. Finally, the Indian Navy intercepts a Portuguese ship, the Anfange, a gunboat that could support the local garrison, but it is soon disarmed. While the main operations take place in Goa, the main battleground, it should be noted that in the small enclave of Diu, Portuguese resistance proves to be more intense, but only thanks to the fortified position of the city and the presence of a coastal fort. Here, India deploys fighter bombers to neutralize the fortifications. The joint land and sea assault, including the amphibious landing, forces a surrender by the morning of December 19th. The conquest of Daman, on the other hand, is very simple. It only takes a couple of hours, and the few Portuguese infantrymen present surrender. The Indian superiority allows for continuous advancement. The Portuguese in Goa are surrounded and isolated. Salazar keeps demanding resistance at all costs, but losses are rising quickly. On the morning of December 19th, less than 36 hours after the start of operations, after Diu has surrendered, the situation is now desperate for the Portuguese forces. Governor Manuel Antonio Vasallo e Silva, an officer, pragmatic and respected, faces a dramatic choice. What should he do? Obey Salazar's order and resist to the end, risking a massacre, or surrender to avoid further losses? Aware of a defeat that is essentially inevitable and deeply opposed to unnecessary bloodshed, Vasallo and Silva decide to surrender. At 8:30 post-meridium on December 19, 1961, after less than 48 hours of fighting, the military commander of the Goa enclave signs the unconditional surrender. Salazar, in Lisbon, is furious. He decides to try Vasallo and Silva in absentia on charges of high treason. But that officer becomes a symbol of dignity and moral responsibility. He saved the lives of thousands of Portuguese people and prevented a senseless massacre. The Indian action on the international stage provokes mixed reactions. The non-aligned movement, which was founded a few years earlier and is beginning to gather members within it. It began among Asia, Indonesia, Africa, and Europe with Yugoslavia. Tito's supporters see the event as a key move toward ending European colonialism and starting a new era. The Third World chooses not to take sides with either one or the other. The United Kingdom and the United States, who are Portugal's partners within NATO, criticize the use of force, but do nothing. They don't impose economic sanctions, nor do they even plan strong diplomatic protests. Together at the United Nations, Portugal is the only country to protest at the United Nations accusing India of aggression, but ends up isolated. Most of the international community considers Portugal's claim to keep colonies unsustainable in a historical period marked by a global process of decolonization, something that cannot be stopped. In India, the operation is welcomed with enthusiasm. The main cities, from New Delhi to Kolkata to Mumbai, are filled with celebrations of joy. And Nehru, who had hoped for a diplomatic solution until the very end, is celebrated for having completed Indian unity. Goa, Daman, and Diu are administered as union territories. In 1987, Goa is granted the status of a federal state. Operation Vijay marks the end of more than 450 years of Portuguese rule on the west coast of India, but its legacy is much more complex, because from that operation, from Operation Vijay, a long wave is unleashed. For Portugal, it's more than just a symbolic blow because, first of all, Salazar's regime, with its imperialist rhetoric, goes into crisis, and it's a crisis that is felt especially in Africa. The Portuguese Empire was an empire that spanned almost the entire globe. Portuguese is spoken in Portugal and in Brazil, the former colony that broke away back in the 19th century. Independent. But Portuguese is spoken in Africa, in Guinea-Bissau, in Angola, in Mozambique. It's spoken in Goa. It's spoken in Macau. It's spoken in East Timor. From that moment on, from that December of 1961, in Africa, in the Portuguese colonies, a second phase begins, a phase of revolt. The independence movements gain courage, gain a voice. They also demand self-determination independence, but they will not be heard. They will not be welcomed. From that moment on, Portugal will get bogged down in colonial wars to keep those overseas provinces at all costs, which Salazar first and Marcelo Caetano after him will never be willing to give up. And it is always from those wars, which drain the Portuguese economy and undermine its social fabric, that new generations of Portuguese people, and especially Portuguese military officers, will be born. Young junior officers, initially drawn by the regime's false promises, but later disillusioned, will decide to bring change. It will be the Revolução dos Cravos, the Grayon Revolution, when captains, lieutenants, and majors rise against the regime, and in an almost bloodless way, they will manage to bring it down, giving it a powerful shove. On the symbolic day of April 25, 1974, but that's another story we've already told you. However, it all began in those December days in Goa, India. There, in the confrontation between an old, crumbling European colonial empire and a new emerging power, the world would change. The world that would no longer be a colonial world, with the old continent plundering the natural resources of African states. It would have been a completely different world, a world that would gradually become the one we know today.